Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Rising. We've got a great show planned for you all this Thursday morning. All-star panelists Will Jawando and Alyssa Farah will be in for Team Rising, and North Carolina State Representative Charles Graham discusses his campaign to unseat GOP incumbent Dan Bishop. Plus, Kim Iverson joins us later in the show.
But first, yesterday, President Biden announced the Port of Los Angeles will operate 24/7 in a step toward relieving supply chain bottlenecks. As we mentioned earlier this week, ports in Los Angeles and Long Beach account for 40% of all shipping containers entering the U.S. The White House says plans are in place to increase capacity with large goods carriers, including Walmart, FedEx, and UPS. Biden calls the announcement a potential game changer in efforts to reassure Americans he can tame high inflation. However, when Biden's supply chain briefing came to a close, he rejected taking questions from reporters. Let's watch.
Thank you all so very much.
Arrive on time, sir. Will they? Can you, Mr. President, what's your administration going to do to lower gasoline prices?
Are you concerned about worker safety?
Do you have a plan for the Federal Reserve?
White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki was pressed on inflation of meat prices and other goods during a press briefing yesterday. Here's her response.
I know you do,
but when the deceleration is happening slower perhaps than people expected a few months ago, and people are still paying 10 or 15 or 20% more for meat, and they're saying, why was it supposed to be transitory 3 months ago, 4 months ago, and we're still here, does that make things more difficult to explain as to why this is the case?
Well, it requires us explaining, and through working with all of you as well, that the cost of meat is also related to competition and the small number of large meat producers who have a dominance over the market, and the fact that a lot of these issues are not as simple as a one-sentence explanation, and that different industries have different issues in the supply chains, different issues that are causing some increases in prices, and also because we all understand the American people are not looking at cost-to-cost comparisons from this year to 2 years ago. They're looking at cost-to-cost comparisons to their checkbooks from 8 months ago or 12 months ago. And even though factually, if you look back to 2 years ago, things may be comparative, that's not how people look at things.
Meat prices are up nearly 17% than they were 2 years ago, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And that's not the only good prices that are up. As Washington Post reporter Heather Long lays out here, rental cars are up 43%, gas is up 42%, used cars are up 24%, bacon up 19%, hotels up 18%, beef, like we said, is up 18%, eggs, TVs, pork all up 13%, kids' shoes up 12%. The list goes on. And so, Robbie, inflation, as you learn in Econ 101, is when you have too much money chasing not enough goods. And so the economists for 40 years have focused on the too much money part.
Right.
Now they're caught blindsided because the problem seems to be the not enough goods situation.
It's wild that. Right, we don't think that actual logistical challenges can matter. That we forget about that.
Everything's just you press the button and you open your front door and there it is.
But suddenly a boat turns the wrong way in the Suez Canal, and then you might not get your deliveries on time. So I think we're actually all kind of being aware of that problem. This has been a year or 2 years for becoming aware of things we didn't know would necessarily be problems. It's been 100 years since the last pandemic. That's something we've evolved past. We have medicine, we have science. Nope. It can come along and it can, knock us down. Obviously, opening the Port of Los Angeles for more hours, as I mentioned the other day, is like a no-brainer fix to this problem that they have to do. So I'm glad they're going to actually have that running more of the time. That seems like a really important key fix to this problem. Right,
and you can do this around the country. You can put more people to work, raise wages, get people out there. There's obviously work to be done. And so what's interesting is that when we think about inflation, we have been taught to think, okay, well, if there's inflation, what we need to do is we need to cut federal spending. The Keynesian approach here. You cut federal spending. That's going to cool things down. And that's going to sort the problem out. But if you disinvest right now, that means you're not opening up the port 24/7. You're not investing in infrastructure to make the ports larger, to make the railways faster, to make the highways move faster, to make it easier to move trucks around. You're not investing in the reconciliation package has money for apprentice projects that are going to create more electricians, more plumbers, more people that you need to build all of the infrastructure that then eases the bottleneck. So ironically, and actually, do we have Stephanie Kelton? She was on earlier this week. She talks about this. She's a modern monetary theorist, and people associate MMT with just throw more money at it. Mm-hmm. She's like, well, the economy has physical constraints, and you need to change those physical constraints if you want to get people moving.
There are constraints. There are real limits in our economy. Our productive capacity is under great strain, not just domestically, but globally. So what do you do about it? I mean, I think what people understand now is that the usual way of fighting inflation, which is to turn to the central bank and say, this is your job, you fix it. What is Jerome Powell? What is the Federal Reserve? What are other central banks supposed to do to deal with bottlenecks in the supply chain that are driving the cost of tennis shoes higher or semiconductor chips? And the answer is not much. So what do? You deal with the constraints, with the bottlenecks, with the supply chain. So, a lot of the things that are in the president's Build Back Better agenda, while they won't do things immediately to alleviate all of the strains in the system, investing in infrastructure, dealing with the kinds of bottlenecks at the ports and roads and bridges and shipping. I mean, those are longer term, but even childcare, the investments in childcare will help alleviate some of the labor shortages.
I'm also curious from a libertarian perspective. She talked about meat monopolies, these factory farm monopolies where you have, JBS controlling almost all of pork, for instance. And so if JBS wants to raise prices go up. Like that's just,
right.
There's no real free market in that.
Yeah, that's the classic monopoly condition, right? When if one firm has total control over some important product, then they can raise the price of it, and you have to. I mean, that's what we've been talking a lot about big tech, and we hear about big tech monopolies, but that's hugely different because they're not charging you for the service, and it competes in a number of different formats. That's what you just described with the meat monopolies is closer to a traditional monopoly. I like to look at, and I'm not very knowledgeable on that particular subject, but I like to look for ways. There's always things that the government is doing to make the monopoly more likely. There's between like licensing or some regulations that disfavor competitors from entering the market. Obviously, you have to have some regulations of food products and things. I get that, but I mean, you were talking about electricians, other fields like that. I mean, hair braiders have to be licensed. It's a racket from governments to protect the existing workers and prevent people from entering into the business. So I like to, before we even have a conversation, I mean, we can have the conversation about what the government needs to affirmatively do, but if there's something it's doing that's bad, that is hurting competition and, gumming up the works, well, it should stop doing that. We should just have it stop doing that. Right, and also, at what point do we need to say keeping prices of factory farm products flat forever isn't necessarily the best goal of a society. Like when you factor in the climate and the ethical implications of mass production of that type of suffering, at some point you're like, okay, so they're up 13%. It's not healthy. It's not healthy for society. It's not healthy for the environment. Okay, maybe we need to eat less of that. Well, there's ethical considerations on both sides, right? Because this is, some people will go hungry. The people who rely on this kind of food are probably disproportionately low income, et cetera. Right. You raise the price. Right. The rich are going to be able to continue to afford it. Exactly. I mean, the rich are vegan, and the rich are increasingly moving in that direction. I mean, and I'm very motivated by the suffering of animals in these kinds of conditions. I think it's horrible, but I mean people rely on people. People's lives matter more ultimately, and right. A back end solution where you just have a monopoly raising prices and isn't really that's not good public policy. But the other thing I was going to say, and Stephanie actually mentioned that in her comments, some of this spending, right, like fixing the roads, the highways, that's not going to alleviate any problem in the short term. That's not going to alleviate any problem for a long time. I mean, the time it takes, there are orange cones on roads for decades sometimes, right? It's so that this is not going to be an overnight magic solution if we're thinking in those terms. Right. When they say shovel ready, that means the port will be expanded in 10 years. Right. But at the Panama Canal pace. 10 years is better than 20. Yeah. For sure. Anyway, we'll tell you what's on our radars up next.